The operating room was silent except for the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. Scalpel in hand, Dr. Jonathan Voss stood over the patient, his voice calm as he instructed the nurses. Clamp the artery now. His hands moved with precision, his confidence unshakable. To everyone in that room, he was a seasoned surgeon, a man who had spent decades mastering the art of healing. But Jonathan Voss had never set foot in a medical school. He had no degree, no residency, no license. He was a fraud, a man who had built an empire of lies on the backs of trusting patients and overworked staff. And this wasn't his first surgery. It wouldn't be his last. Jonathan wasn't born a con artist. He was born Jonathan Miller, a high school dropout from a working-class neighborhood in Cleveland. At 19, he landed a job as a janitor at St. Mary's Hospital, sweeping floors and emptying trash bins. But Jonathan wasn't content with mopping up other people's messes. He wanted to be the one giving orders, the one wearing the white coat, the one everyone deferred to. So he watched. He listened. He learned the lingo, the mannerisms, the subtle cues that made a doctor feel like a doctor. He studied how real surgeons carried themselves, how they snapped gloves onto their hands, how they barked commands without hesitation, how they never flinched at the sight of blood. By the time he was 22, Jonathan had memorized enough medical jargon to pass himself off as a resident. All he needed was the paperwork. Forging credentials was easier than he expected. A quick trip to a print shop, a few tweaks to a template he found online, and suddenly, Jonathan Miller became Dr. Jonathan Voss, MD, graduate of the fictional Midwest College of Medicine. He applied for a low-level administrative job at a rural clinic in Ohio, where no one bothered to verify his degree. Within months, he'd worked his way up to physician assistant, then consulting specialist, all while fabricating references and dodging background checks. By the time he arrived at St. Luke's Medical Center in Chicago, a prestigious hospital with a waiting list for patients, he was Dr. Voss, board-certified surgeon, with a fake LinkedIn profile, a stolen license number, and a network of accomplices who looked the other way for a cut of his salary. This wasn't an isolated incident. Across America, imposters infiltrate critical roles every year. In 2019, a man in Texas posed as an anesthesiologist for 11 years, administering drugs he barely understood. In 2021, a woman in California ran a fertility clinic with a forged medical degree, leaving dozens of patients with failed treatments and shattered hopes. The common thread? Systems designed to trust, not verify. Hospitals, desperate to fill staffing gaps, often skip credential checks. Colleagues, overwhelmed by their own workloads, assume someone else has done the due diligence. And patients see a white coat and a stethoscope and believe they're in capable hands. But a uniform doesn't make a doctor. A diploma doesn't make a healer. What makes a doctor is years of training, humility, and a commitment to not guessing when lives are on the line. Jonathan's rise was fueled by one brutal truth. Confidence is more convincing than competence. At St. Luke's, he mastered the art of deflecting doubt. When a nurse questioned his decision to skip a pre-op scan, he'd smirk and say, "Trust me, I've done this 1,000 times." When a junior doctor hesitated during a procedure, he'd bark, "This isn't your first rodeo, is it?" He weaponized authority, turning uncertainty into a sign of weakness. And it worked. Staff stopped questioning him because challenging a senior surgeon felt riskier than going along with his orders. One nurse later admitted, "I thought someone must have checked his credentials. Why would I doubt him?" That's the trap. We assume systems protect us, but systems are only as strong as the people who enforce them. A uniform doesn't make a doctor. A title doesn't make an expert. And blind trust? Blind trust is the con artist's best friend. Jonathan's first major test came during a routine appendectomy. The patient, a 34-year-old teacher named Maria Rodriguez, had been rushed in with severe abdominal pain. As Jonathan made the incision, he froze. The anatomy didn't match the diagrams he'd studied online. Panic surged. He'd never performed this surgery before. But he couldn't show fear. He couldn't admit ignorance. So he improvised, faking his way through the procedure with a mix of guesswork and borrowed techniques he'd observed from real surgeons. Maria survived, but she developed a post-op infection that nearly killed her. When colleagues reviewed the case, they blamed unforeseen complications. No one suspected the truth. The man holding the scalpel had no idea what he was doing. This is how fraud thrives, not in the spotlight, but in the shadows of our assumptions. Jonathan didn't need to be perfect, he just needed to be plausible. He exploited the gap between what we expect from authority figures and what we're willing to verify. Hospitals prioritized speed over safety. Staff prioritized harmony over accountability. And patients prioritized hope over skepticism. But here's the chilling reality. Jonathan wasn't some mastermind. He was an ordinary man who realized something extraordinary. People will believe what they want to believe. They wanted to trust their doctor, so they did. They wanted to believe the system worked, so they ignored the red flags. And that's how a high school dropout with a fake diploma became one of the most respected surgeons in Chicago. A uniform doesn't make a doctor. But for years, no one cared to look behind the curtain. Jonathan's empire of lies was growing, and the stakes were about to get deadly. Because once you've fooled the world into believing you're a healer, the next step is believing it yourself. And that's when the real danger begins. Confidence isn't earned, it's performed. And no one understood that better than Jonathan Voss. By the time he landed at St. Luke's, he'd perfected the art of sounding like an expert while knowing nothing. His secret? He didn't try to learn medicine. He learned people. Jonathan's playbook was simple. Never hesitate, never apologize, and never admit uncertainty. During rounds, he'd stride into patient rooms with a clipboard, scanning charts he barely understood. If a diagnosis stumped him, he'd pivot to jargon. This presents as atypical. Or, we need to rule out systemic involvement. The phrases were vague enough to sound authoritative but specific enough to silence doubters. Nurses and residents, eager to impress, rarely questioned him. After all, real doctors spoke this way, didn't they? One colleague recalled, he'd say things like, "Let's escalate to broad-spectrum antibiotics," and everyone just nodded. Who were we to argue? That's the power of linguistic mirroring. Copy the language of experts, and people assume you are one. But confidence alone isn't enough. You need props. Jonathan invested in the theater of medicine. He wore tailored suits under his lab coat, carried a vintage stethoscope he'd bought on eBay, and always had a pen tucked behind his ear, the kind real doctors used to jot notes. He even practiced his handwriting to mimic the illegible scrawl of overworked physicians. When a patient once asked why his prescription looked so messy, he laughed and said, "If it's neat, it's not medical." It was a small detail, but it worked. People associate quirks with authenticity.
A Messi signature?
Must be a busy doctor. A rush tone? Must be in demand. Jonathan weaponized these biases, turning stereotypes into shields against suspicion. The most dangerous tool in his arsenal was the assumption of expertise. At a staff meeting in 2020, Jonathan confidently recommended a radical new treatment for a rare heart condition. A treatment he'd read about in a Time magazine article the night before. No one checked his sources. Why would they? He was Dr. Voss, a man who'd supposedly published papers and spoken at conferences. He hadn't. When a cardiologist later questioned the protocol, Jonathan shut him down. "I've seen this work in dozens of cases. Are you suggesting I don't know my field?" The room fell silent. No one wanted to be the one to challenge a senior colleague. That's the con artist's dream. When doubt is seen as disrespect, the lie becomes untouchable. This isn't unique to medicine. In 2016, a man named Adam Gray posed as a Silicon Valley CEO for 3 years, wowing investors with buzzwords like blockchain synergy and disruptive AI. He'd never coded a line of software, but he'd studied enough TED Talks to fake it. In 2019, a woman in New York convinced a museum she was a curator from the Louvre, using Google Translate to mimic French accents during calls. The pattern is always the same. Exploit the gap between what people expect from experts and what they're willing to verify. If you sound certain, they'll believe you. If you act like you belong, they'll assume you do. And if you punish doubt with arrogance, they'll apologize for questioning you. Jonathan took this further. He turned weaknesses into strengths. When he didn't know a drug's dosage, he'd say, "Let's start low and titrate up, safety first." When he struggled to interpret an X-ray, he'd declare, "This is ambiguous. We need a second opinion." To staff, it seemed cautious. To patients, it seemed thorough. But it was all misdirection. By framing ignorance as prudence, he made his lack of knowledge feel like a virtue. One nurse admitted, "I thought his humility was a sign of good judgment. Now I realize it was just a cover." The lesson here isn't just about fraud. It's about us. Why do we trust so easily? Because verification is hard. Because challenging authority is uncomfortable. Because deep down, we want to believe the people we depend on are qualified. Jonathan knew this. He didn't outsmart the system. He exploited our reluctance to question it. Trust without verification isn't just naive. It's a recipe for disaster. And as Jonathan's empire grew, the disaster was coming. Because the more he lied, the more he needed to lie to cover the lies. And that's when even the most confident frauds start to crack. The scalpel trembled in Jonathan Voss's hand. Not enough for anyone to notice, but he felt it. Sweat beaded under his surgical cap as he stared at Maria Rodriguez's exposed abdomen. The textbooks he'd skimmed online showed neat diagrams of appendixes nestled like pearls in an oyster. Reality was a bloody, pulsating maze of tissue he couldn't name. Left or right, artery or vein. Panic clawed at his throat. He'd watched dozens of appendectomies on YouTube, but the screen couldn't replicate the smell of seared flesh or the way organs shifted under pressure. Maria's heart monitor beeped steadily. Beep, beep, beep. A metronome counting down to catastrophe. Jonathan forced his voice calm. Suction, please. As the nurse cleared the blood, he spotted the appendix, a swollen, angry tube. That's it. Cut it out. How hard could it be? He'd seen it done in under 30 minutes. But as he clamped the mesentery, his fingers slipped. A spurt of arterial blood flooded the incision. Nurses gasped. Damn it! Jonathan snapped, snatching a gauze pad. Hold pressure now. His mind raced. Was this the inferior mesenteric artery? The diagrams never showed it bleeding this fast. He fumbled for a ligature, his pulse hammering in his ears. If I can't stop this, she bleeds out on my table. And then what? He tied the vessel blindly, praying it was the right one. The bleeding slowed. Relief washed over him until he saw the tear in the bowel wall. A nick from his shaky scalpel. One mistake. 1 second of doubt. He'd ruined her. Panicked, he sutured the hole with rushed, uneven stitches. Close her up, he ordered, voice tight. And cancel my next 2 surgeries. I need to review her case. As the nurses stitched Maria's abdomen, Jonathan fled to his office, locking the door behind him. He Googled bowel perforation repair on his phone, hands shaking. Peritonitis, sepsis, death. The words blurred on the screen. He'd just gambled with a woman's life and lost. Maria woke screaming in recovery. Her abdomen was rigid, her skin clammy. Nurses rushed to her side. Dr. Voss. She's tachycardic. 140. Jonathan forced calm into his voice. Post-op pain.
Give her morphine.
But when her fever spiked to 104 degrees Fahrenheit, even he couldn't ignore it. He ordered a CT scan he didn't know how to read. The radiologist called. Alarmed. There's free air in her abdomen. She's perforated. Jonathan's blood ran cold. His fault. He'd botched the repair. Now Maria was hours from septic shock. He stalled, inventing excuses. Maybe it's a scan artifact. Let's wait 6 hours. But when Maria stopped breathing, he had no choice. He called the real surgeons, the ones he'd avoided for years. They opened her up and found the truth. A haphazard repair leaking pus into her abdomen. Who did this? The chief surgeon demanded, holding up the torn sutures. Jonathan lied. I was called away mid-procedure. Must have been the resident. The resident, a terrified young man who'd never touched Maria, was fired. Maria survived after a 12-hour emergency surgery, but her recovery took months. Her husband, Carlos, sat by her bed, whispering, "That doctor knew. I saw it in his eyes when he left the room." But when Carlos complained to hospital admin, he was handed a pamphlet. Trust your care team. No one questioned Dr. Voss. Why would they? He was respected. He'd saved her. Hadn't he? This wasn't an anomaly. In 2018, a fake psychiatrist in Florida prescribed lethal doses of antipsychotics to a bipolar patient. The man died, but his family was silenced with a $500,000 settlement and an NDA. In 2022, a phony neurologist in Boston misdiagnosed a stroke as migraine with aura, leaving a patient permanently paralyzed. When the truth surfaced, the hospital blamed systemic communication failures. The pattern is chilling. A single mistake can cost a life. But what if there's no expertise to begin with? Jonathan knew this. After Maria, he stopped improvising. He started stealing. He'd linger outside operating rooms, memorizing techniques from real surgeons. He'd steal patient charts to study diagnoses he didn't understand. One nurse caught him frantically flipping through a medical textbook during rounds. Just refreshing my memory, he'd smirked. She said nothing. Who questions a senior doctor? The real horror? Maria's case was routine for Jonathan. In the 2 years before his downfall, He performed over 200 procedures he was utterly unqualified for. A gallbladder removal where he accidentally cut the common bile duct. A colonoscopy where he perforated the intestine again. Each time, he covered it with lies. Complications happen. The patient was high risk. Hospital staff, desperate to believe their institution was infallible, swallowed it. One anesthesiologist later admitted, "I knew something was off, but I thought, maybe I'm the idiot here." That's the fraud's greatest weapon, making victims doubt themselves. Would you notice if your surgeon was lying? Most people wouldn't. We're wired to trust white coats, not scrutinize them. We assume the system filters out fakes. But systems are run by humans, and humans are lazy, overworked, and afraid of rocking the boat. Jonathan's near miss with Maria taught him a brutal lesson. Never operate alone. He started recruiting accomplices. A billing clerk who forged insurance claims. A nurse who lost problematic records. A resident he blackmailed with fabricated malpractice threats. "You help me or I bury you," he'd whisper in dimly lit stairwells. Soon, his fraud wasn't a solo act, it was a conspiracy. And the hospital rewarded him. After saving Maria, in their telling, St. Luke's promoted him to head of general surgery. They gave him a corner office, a 6-figure bonus, and carte blanche over junior staff. The more lives he risked, the higher he climbed. This is how medical fraud metastasizes. Not with sirens and red flags, but in quiet moments of willful ignorance. When the billing clerk noticed Jonathan's fake license number but stayed silent because someone else must have checked. When the radiologist saw his misread scans but said nothing to avoid drama. When Carlos Rodriguez begged for answers and was handed a pamphlet. A single mistake can cost a life. But what happens when the mistake isn't accidental? When it's the foundation of the entire operation? Maria survived. Others wouldn't, because Jonathan wasn't done. He'd tasted power, the godlike feeling of holding lives in his unqualified hands. And he was getting bolder. By early 2021, he'd moved beyond routine surgeries. He started volunteering for high-stakes cases, pediatric trauma, complex oncology. "I live for these challenges," he'd tell reporters during a hospital fundraiser. Cameras flashed as he posed with a child cancer patient. The photo went viral. Hero surgeon saves little girl. But behind the scenes, he was drowning. The pediatric oncology case? He'd never treated cancer in his life. He faked chemotherapy protocols using WebMD articles. When the child's condition worsened, he blamed aggressive biology. No one questioned the hero. Heroes aren't supposed to lie. The truth is, frauds like Jonathan don't fail because they're caught. They fail because they believe their own lies. After Maria, he stopped seeing himself as a fraud. He was Dr. Voss, a healer, a savior. And that's when the real danger began. Because a man who thinks he's invincible will take risks that terrify even the most reckless con artist. He'll operate on a CEO's child. He'll perform experimental procedures. He'll ignore the nurse who finally speaks up. And when the house of cards collapses, thousands will pay the price. Maria Rodriguez's near-death was just the first crack in the dam. But no one saw it. No one wanted to see it. Because admitting Jonathan was a fraud meant admitting the entire system was broken. And that was a truth St. Luke's wasn't ready to face. Not yet. Not until it was too late. It started with a whisper in the nurse's station. "Did you see how he held the scalpel during Mrs. Chen's surgery? Like he'd never held one before." The nurse who spoke, Linda Cho, immediately regretted it. Her colleague's eyes widened. "Dr. Voss? Don't be ridiculous. He's won awards." Linda dropped the subject. Better to doubt herself than risk her job. This is the silent engine of medical fraud. Groupthink. At St. Luke's, questioning Jonathan wasn't just discouraged. It was treated as betrayal. Staff operated under an unspoken rule. Never undermine a colleague's authority. When a resident hesitated during a surgery Jonathan botched, he was pulled aside by the chief of staff. "You embarrassed Dr. Voss in front of the team. That's unacceptable." When Linda noticed Jonathan's medical degree hanging crookedly in his office, revealing a blurry photocopy beneath the frame, she said nothing. Someone must have checked it, she told herself. I'm probably overreacting. The truth? Verification was a joke. St. Luke's credentialing process took 3 days. Jonathan submitted a forged diploma from Midwest College of Medicine, a school that didn't exist. The HR clerk, buried under 200 applications, didn't call the dean's office. A voicemail box Jonathan monitored. She checked a box. Credentials verified. Later, she'd testify, "I assumed the system worked. Why wouldn't I?" That's the core delusion. Trust without verification is a recipe for disaster. Hospitals prioritize speed over safety. In 2023, 42% of U.S. healthcare facilities admitted skipping background checks during staffing shortages. At St. Luke's, the credentialing officer handled 50 hires a month. She had 15 minutes per file. Jonathan's fake license? Proved in 8. But bureaucracy was only half the problem. The real killer was fear. Jonathan ruled through psychological terror. When a young surgeon corrected his misdiagnosis of a tumor, Jonathan cornered him in a supply closet. "You think you're smarter than me? I'll make sure you never operate again." The surgeon quit that week. When a nurse questioned his prescription of a dangerous drug combo, Jonathan reported her to admin for insubordination. She was suspended. Soon, staff learned the code. See no evil. Hear no evil. One or tech described it. We'd all notice things, the way he froze during emergencies, the way he avoided complex procedures. But saying it out loud felt like suicide. This isn't unique to medicine. In 2020, Boeing engineers knew the 737 MAX was unsafe, but feared reporting it would cost their jobs. In 2015, Wells Fargo employees created millions of fake accounts under pressure to meet quotas. The pattern is universal. When speaking up feels riskier than staying silent, silence becomes the norm. At St. Luke's, Jonathan weaponized this. He turned colleagues into accomplices. He'd assign junior doctors to observe his surgeries, knowing they'd fear contradicting him. After a near-fatal error, he'd gather the team. "We all messed up today, but if anyone breathes a word of this," he'd leave the threat hanging. Staff nodded, united in guilt. If everyone assumes someone else is checking, no one checks. The most dangerous enabler was admiration. Jonathan wasn't just respected, he was idolized. He hosted lavish parties for hospital donors, schmoozing with Chicago's elite. He donated to charity galas. He gave TEDx talks on innovative surgical leadership. When a journalist questioned his credentials, the hospital PR team buried it. "Dr. Voss is a visionary. This is a smear campaign." Patients adored him. He'd hold their hands, quote poetry, promise miracles. One woman wrote, "He saved my life with his intuition." That's the fraud's dream. When victims defend their victimizer. Maria Rodriguez's husband, Carlos, even apologized to Jonathan after the near miss. "I'm sorry I doubted you." Jonathan patted his shoulder. "No need. I understand fear." But the dam finally cracked in March 2022. A new anesthesiologist, Dr. Eris Thorne, noticed Jonathan struggling to intubate a patient. Real surgeons don't fumble with a laryngoscope, Eris thought. He checked Jonathan's license number online. It was registered to a dentist in Ohio. Eris reported it to credentialing. The response? "We'll look into it." Weeks passed. No action. Eris confronted the chief of staff. "This man isn't a doctor." The reply, "Dr. Voss is a star. Your concerns are unprofessional." Eris went home shaking. He knew the drill. Blow the whistle, lose your career. Stay silent, risk lives. He chose silence. For 3 more months. Why? Because silence enables deception. At St. Luke's, it wasn't malice that protected Jonathan. It was exhaustion. Nurses working 16-hour shifts didn't have energy to fight. Residents focused on surviving their training. Administrators cared more about lawsuits than truth. Jonathan exploited this perfectly. He made calling him out feel worse than the fraud itself. One nurse confessed, "I'd lie awake thinking, what if I'm wrong? What if I ruin an innocent man's life?" That's the fraudster's ultimate shield, weaponizing our empathy against us. The breaking point came when Jonathan operated on a 12-year-old boy with a brain tumor. The surgery was far beyond his skill. Neurosurgeons use microscopes and 3D imaging. Jonathan faked it. Halfway through, he realized he'd severed a critical artery. The boy hemorrhaged on the table. As code blue alarms blared, Jonathan fled to his office. The real neurosurgeon took over, saving the boy, but leaving him with permanent vision loss. When the parents demanded answers, the hospital buried it. Unforeseen complications, but Eris Thorne snapped. He leaked Jonathan's fake license to the Chicago Tribune. The article ran on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, St. Luke's launched an internal review. By Friday, Jonathan was on paid leave. By Monday, the FBI raided his mansion. But the real question wasn't how he was caught. It was why it took so long. The answer lives in every hospital, every workplace, every system that values harmony over truth. Silence enables deception. And at St. Luke's, silence wasn't just golden. It was deadly. Jonathan Voss didn't just want to be a doctor. He wanted to be untouchable. By 2021, his fraud had metastasized into something far more dangerous than surgical charades. It became an empire built on stolen identities, forged prescriptions, and a network of terrified accomplices. The $2 million yacht wasn't payment for surgeries. It was a bribe to keep a whistleblower quiet. And this was only the beginning. It started with pharmaceuticals. Jonathan noticed how freely opioids flowed through St. Luke's. Surgeons prescribed them. Pharmacists dispensed them. Addicts craved them. He saw a gap. Using his fake DEA license, he began ordering massive quantities of fentanyl and oxycodone, not for patients but for the black market. He'd scribble post-op pain management on scripts for healthy-looking men who'd never set foot in surgery. When a pharmacist flagged an unusually high dose, Jonathan leaned in, voice dripping with condescension. "This is my patient. Are you questioning my judgment?" The pharmacist backed down. Who questions a top surgeon? Soon, Jonathan was pocketing $50,000 a week, laundering cash through offshore shell companies he'd set up under aliases. One shipment alone, 2,000 Percocet tablets, ended up in the hands of a 17-year-old who overdosed in a Chicago high school bathroom. Jonathan never knew her name. He didn't care. But drugs were just the appetizer. Jonathan's real ambition was medical technology. He'd read about Theranos, the blood testing startup that defrauded investors of $700 million, and saw a blueprint. He pitched St. Luke's on Project Aegis, a revolutionary AI system that could diagnose cancer from a single drop of blood. He'd stolen the concept from a real oncology conference, memorizing slides during coffee breaks. Hospital executives, dazzled by his TEDx fame, greenlit a $10 million pilot. Jonathan used the funds to buy cheap Chinese sensors, slap his logo on them, and hire coders to fake the software. When early tests showed the device couldn't distinguish blood from water, he fired the engineers and blamed calibration errors. To investors, he promised miracles. Imagine catching stage for cancer in seconds. They wrote bigger checks. Meanwhile, real patients with suspicious moles were handed false all-clear reports from his junk machine. One woman, Linda Torres, skipped her biopsy because Dr. Voss's AI said I was fine. By the time she felt the lump in her breast, it had spread to her bones. Jonathan's web tightened around everyone at St. Luke's. He turned colleagues into prisoners with 3 master tactics: money, fear, and complicity. For the billing clerk who first noticed his fake license number, he offered $10,000 a month to alter records. For the nurse who saw him misread an EKG, he threatened, "I'll tell admin you stole morphine." And for the ambitious residents, he made them partners in the fraud. Dr. Evan Reed, a talented young surgeon, was handed a scalpel during a critical heart surgery Jonathan couldn't handle. "You do the work," Jonathan whispered. "I'll take the credit." When Evan hesitated, Jonathan slid a folder across the table. Photos of Evan's secret gambling debts. "Be a team player, or these go to your wife." Soon, Evan was covering for Jonathan's mistakes, signing off on procedures he'd performed alone. Every lie builds on the last until the truth collapses everything. Jonathan knew this. He'd weave threads of deceit so tightly that pulling one would unravel careers, marriages, lives. The system enabled him at every turn. When the DEA called to verify his license, Jonathan intercepted the call using a fake ID as St. Luke's compliance officer. "Yes, Dr. Voss is fully credentialed. Must be a database error." When a pharmaceutical rep questioned his opioid orders, he invited her to a private dinner, then threatened to expose her company's kickbacks if she spoke up. Even the FBI stumbled into his trap. In 2022, an agent investigating opioid trafficking showed up at St. Luke's. Jonathan greeted him in scrubs, radiating concern. "I've been begging admin to tighten controls. Let me help your investigation." He fed the agent falsified logs, diverting the probe toward a dead-end pharmacy. The agent later admitted, "He seemed so genuinely outraged. I thought I'd found an ally." That's the con artist's superpower. They make you want to believe them. Jonathan's arrogance peaked in the spring of 2022. He'd been invited to speak at the American Medical Association conference, a stage reserved for legends. Backstage, he panicked. Real doctors would ask technical questions. He couldn't bluff his way through a discussion of CRISPR gene editing. So he did what he always did, stole. He hacked the email of Dr. Naomi Chen, a pioneering oncologist, and copied her entire presentation. Minutes before taking the stage, he rehearsed her slides in a bathroom stall, mouthing phrases like tumor microenvironment heterogeneity. On stage, he delivered her speech flawlessly, using her data, her jokes, even her signature phrase, "Cancer isn't one disease, it's 1,000 whispers." The audience gave a standing ovation. A reporter called it the most visionary talk of the decade. That night, Jonathan celebrated on his yacht, toasting with Dom Perignon, while Dr. Chen's stolen research funded his next lie. But cracks were spreading. Dr. Eris Thorne, the anesthesiologist who discovered Jonathan's fake license, had gone quiet, but not silent. He'd spent months gathering evidence. Screenshots of Jonathan searching how to read MRI scans during surgeries, voicemails where he pressured nurses to falsify records, even a photo of the Midwest College of Medicine diploma, its blurry edges visible when held to light. Eris knew one mistake would end him. Jonathan had spies everywhere. So he hid the evidence in plain sight. Encrypted files buried in St. Luke's public server, disguised as routine billing data. He mailed a key to the files to a journalist, then waited. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in June. Jonathan was prepping for a high-profile surgery, removing a tumor from the daughter of Chicago's mayor. As he scrubbed in, a nurse whispered, "Dr. Voss, the anesthesiologist just quit. It's Dr. Thorne." Jonathan's blood froze. Thorne, the man who knew his secret. He tried to cancel the surgery, sudden conflict of interest, but the mayor's office had cleared the ore. No escape. During the procedure, Jonathan froze when he saw the tumor's location. This wasn't in the scans. Panic surged. He needed to stall. "Thorne," he snapped, "check the patient's potassium levels. Now." But Thorne didn't move. He locked eyes with Jonathan and said, loud enough for your team to hear, "I already did. It's 3.8. Normal." Jonathan's hands trembled. Thorne knew he was faking. The surgery descended into chaos. Jonathan botched the resection, nicking an artery. As blood flooded the incision, Thorne took over, shouting orders to save the girl. Jonathan fled the OR, slamming the door behind him. That night, Thorne received a text from an unknown number. "You shouldn't have done that. We'll see who the hospital believes, a star surgeon or a troublemaking anesthesiologist." Jonathan had struck first. Within hours, hospital security found oxycodone in Thorne's locker. He was suspended pending investigation. But as Thorne packed his office, he smiled. Because the evidence was already out there, hidden in St. Luke's server, waiting for the journalist to find it. Jonathan thought he'd buried Thorne. Instead, he'd lit the fuse. Because every lie builds on the last until the truth collapses everything. And this house of cards was about to fall. Sarah Chin didn't die from cancer. She died because her oncologist Googled chemo protocols mid-surgery. Her story wasn't unique. It was one of 3,200. And Jonathan Voss never even learned her name. Sarah was 28, a violinist with the Chicago Symphony, when she found the lump. St. Luke's assigned her to Dr. Voss, the visionary behind Project Aegis. Jonathan saw dollar signs. A young, wealthy patient with doting parents? Perfect for his fake AI diagnostics. He ran her blood through his Chinese sensor rig, then stared at the blank screen. He hadn't programmed it to read real data. So he lied, early-stage carcinoma. But Aegis caught it in time. Sarah wept with relief. Jonathan patted her hand. "I'll cure you." He prescribed a cocktail of chemo drugs he'd copied from WebMD, doses so high they'd kill a horse. When Sarah's hair fell out in clumps and she vomited blood, Jonathan blamed aggressive cancer. He upped the dosage. The truth emerged only after Sarah collapsed during a rehearsal. Real oncologists found her chart. Jonathan had prescribed triple the safe limit of doxorubicin. Her heart was failing. "This isn't cancer," one doctor said, tears in his eyes. "This is poisoning." Sarah died 2 weeks later, her parents holding her hands as her heart gave out. Jonathan sent flowers. A tragic loss. Medicine is imperfect. He never attended the funeral. To him, Sarah was just another complication. A line item in his ledger of lies. Sarah's story mirrors a pattern of carnage. In 2019, a 65-year-old veteran named Henry Briggs trusted Jonathan with a routine knee replacement. Jonathan, who'd never performed orthopedic surgery, botched the alignment. Henry spent 2 years in agony before a second opinion revealed his leg was permanently deformed. He killed himself in 2021. In 2022, A diabetic patient named Maria Lopez was given Jonathan's revolutionary insulin protocol, a mix of untested supplements he'd bought from a Chinese supplier. Her blood sugar crashed to 20. She survived but lost both legs to gangrene. When Maria sued, St. Luke's settled for $1.2 million and buried the records. Jonathan kept his job. The most chilling pattern? Jonathan targeted the vulnerable. Immigrants who didn't speak English. Elderly patients with no family. The poor who couldn't afford second opinions. He'd charm them with broken Spanish or promises of free care. Then bill insurance for procedures he never performed. One woman, Rosa Gutierrez, paid $20,000 out of pocket for a life-saving surgery that was just a 15-minute incision. When she complained, Jonathan threatened, "I'll tell immigration you used a fake ID." Rosa cleaned houses for a living. She stayed silent. But the worst victims were the children. Jonathan volunteered for pediatric cases, the ones where parents were too desperate to question authority. 8-year-old Liam O'Malley had a benign brain cyst. Jonathan saw a chance to prove his surgical genius. During the operation, he severed a critical vein. Liam survived but lost vision in one eye. His mother, Bridget, begged for answers. "Why did this happen?" Jonathan sighed, radiating sorrow. "Sometimes, the brain fights back." Bridget believed him. She even donated to his charity fund. These weren't accidents. They were inevitable. When you lack training, every decision is a gamble. Jonathan's diagnoses were often wild guesses. He once told a patient with a stomach virus she had advanced pancreatic cancer to justify ordering expensive scans he could bill for. She spent 6 months in terror before a second opinion proved she was healthy. Jonathan didn't care. To him, patients were props in his performance of expertise. As he told a billing clerk during a drunken yacht party, "They're not people, they're revenue streams." The scale of harm only surfaced after his arrest. FBI agents combed through St. Luke's records and found 412 patients given incorrect cancer diagnoses, 87 surgical errors that caused permanent disability, 22 fatalities directly linked to his malpractice, $14.3 million in fraudulent insurance claims. But statistics can't capture the human wreckage. Like David Kim, Sarah Chen's fiancé, who still carries her concert program in his wallet, or Henry Briggs' widow, who scrubbed his wheelchair marks off their hardwood floors for years, or Liam O'Malley, who flinches when doctors approach his face. Innocent lives are always the collateral damage of unchecked ambition. And Jonathan's ambition had no limits. The breaking point came from an unexpected source: Sarah Chen's violin. After her death, her parents donated it to a youth orchestra. During a recital, a reporter heard the concertmaster mention Sarah's miracle doctor. He dug deeper. Within weeks, the Chicago Tribune published "The Doctor Who Killed with Kindness," naming Sarah, Henry, Maria, and Liam. The article went viral. St. Luke's finally suspended Jonathan, but still called it a leave of absence. Parents of pediatric patients showed up at protests with photos of their injured children. One held a sign, "My daughter lost her eye so he could buy a yacht." Jonathan watched the protests from his penthouse, sipping scotch. He told his lawyer, "They'll forget in a month. People always do." But this time they didn't, because Sarah Chen's story had ignited something primal. The fury of those who trusted the white coat only to have their faith weaponized against them. Her violin became a symbol. At the next protest, 200 people played her favorite piece, Adagio for strings, outside St. Luke's. The sound carried into Jonathan's empty office. Innocent lives are always the collateral damage. But this time, the collateral wouldn't stay silent. Dr. Eris Thorne didn't plan to be a hero. He just couldn't sleep. Every night, he'd see Sarah Chen's face, the one he'd saved from Jonathan's scalpel during the mayor's daughter's surgery. He'd hear her parents' sobs at her funeral. And he knew, if he stayed silent, someone else would die. Eris's evidence was a time bomb. He'd hidden it in St. Luke's billing server under the file name Q4_revenue_report_encrypted.zip, a folder no one would question. Inside, 37 hours of or audio recordings, Jonathan whispering, "What's the next step?" to nurses mid-surgery. Screenshots of his Google searches. How to stop internal bleeding during Maria Rodriguez's near-fatal procedure. The voicemail that changed everything. Jonathan's voice, cold and precise. "You talk, I bury you." But Eris had no proof he was the source. Jonathan's retaliation had been swift. After the mayor's daughter surgery, St. Luke's found oxycodone in Eris's locker. Security footage showed him pocketing pills. His medical license was suspended. His wife, a pediatrician, faced whispers at her clinic. Their savings vanished in legal fees. One night, he found his car tires slashed. The message was clear: back off or worse will come. Eris chose to fight. He contacted journalist Maya Rodriguez, no relation to Maria Rodriguez, the same reporter who tried to expose Jonathan's fake credentials years earlier. Maya met him in a 24-hour diner at 3 a.m. Eris slid a USB drive across the table. This gets published, I lose everything. But if it doesn't, someone dies tomorrow. Maya took the drive. 2 days later, St. Luke's security found drugs in her car during a routine parking lot sweep. The hospital's message to Maya: "We see you." She went underground, working from a friend's basement. The turning point came from an unlikely ally, Evan Reed, Jonathan's former protege. After Sarah Chen's death, Evan cracked. He'd covered for Jonathan's mistakes for 2 years, signing off on surgeries he'd performed alone. But Sarah was his cousin. At her funeral, her mother whispered, "He promised to save her." Evan couldn't bury his guilt any longer. He reached out to Maya with one condition: "Protect my family. I have 2 kids." Evan's evidence was damning. He'd kept a secret log of Jonathan's errors. June 12th, botched Liam O'Malley's craniotomy. Told parents the tumor was aggressive. It was benign. August 3rd, gave Maria Lopez lethal insulin mix.
Blamed the non-compliance punto.
She's blind in one eye now. October 17th, faked Project Aegis results for investor demo. Patient had stage 1 cancer. Told her it was stage 4 to bill for chemo. Evan also gave Maya the master key: Jonathan's offshore accounts. Every shell company, every bribe, every stolen patient dollar. "He's not just a fraud," Evan said, tears streaming. "He's a predator. And I helped him." Jonathan smelled the trap. He called Evan into his office, closed the blinds. "You're making a mistake," he hissed. "I know where your kids go to school." Evan walked out, but not before Jonathan shoved a manila envelope into his chest. Inside, photos of Evan's children at their elementary school, taken that morning. The message was clear: "I own you." That night, Evan sat in his garage, a gun in his hand. He thought of Sarah's violin. He thought of Liam O'Malley's blind eye. He loaded the chamber. Then his phone buzzed. A text from Maya: "We have enough. Come to the Tribune building. Now." Evan dropped the gun. He drove through the night, arriving at the Chicago Tribune offices as dawn broke. Maya met him with coffee and a smile. Time to bury the bastard. The next 48 hours were a chess match. Jonathan's lawyers flooded the hospital with gag orders. His PR team smeared Maya as a disgraced reporter with an agenda. St. Luke's CEO issued a statement: "Dr. Voss remains a valued member of our team," but Maya had already sent copies of the evidence to the FBI, the AMA, and 60 Minutes. The final blow came from inside St. Luke's. Linda Cho, the nurse who'd first questioned Jonathan's scalpel grip, dug out her phone. 3 years earlier, she'd recorded Jonathan berating a resident after a near-miss surgery. She'd kept it as insurance. Now, she sent it to Maya with one word: "Now." The audio was explosive. Jonathan's voice, dripping with contempt. "You think I care about this patient? I care about my bonus. Fix your mistake, or I'll make sure you scrub floors for the rest of your life." The residents choked sob. The beep of a heart monitor in the background. Maya published it at 8 a.m. By 9 a.m., the FBI was at St. Luke's. By 10 a.m., Jonathan's yacht was seized. By noon, Evan Reed stood before cameras, tears on his face. "I enabled a monster. I'm so sorry." Change starts with one voice. Eris Thorne's voice, Evan Reed's voice, Linda Cho's voice, and now, Maya Rodriguez's voice, shouting the truth into the void. The cost was everything: careers, safety, peace of mind. But as Evan said that day, some silences are louder than screams, and this one had to end. The FBI kicked in Jonathan Voss's penthouse door at 6:03 a.m. on a rain-slicked Tuesday. Jonathan was still in silk pajamas, staring at the Chicago Tribune headline on his tablet. "The doctor is a fraud. 3,200 patients endangered." He didn't run. He didn't beg. He laughed. A sharp, disbelieving cackle, as Special Agent Maria Ruiz cuffed him. "You think this matters?" He spat, nodding at the agents swarming his $8 million condo. I've saved more lives than you've had hot meals. They'll take me back by noon. He was dead wrong. The raid wasn't just about Jonathan, it was about erasing him. Agents seized 17 encrypted hard drives, a safe filled with fake passports, under names like Dr. Julian Cross and Dr. Elias Vance, and a ledger detailing $4.2 million in bribes to St. Luke's administrators. But the most damning evidence came from his yacht. In the captain's cabin, agents found a locked safe containing not cash or drugs, but patient files, not medical records, blackmail dossiers, photos of Evan Reed's children, audio of Carlos Rodriguez admitting he'd tampered with evidence to protect Jonathan. Even Linda Cho's personnel file, stamped terminate if she talks. Jonathan hadn't just faked credentials. He'd built a surveillance state inside St. Luke's. Outside the penthouse, chaos erupted. Nurses from St. Luke's gathered on the sidewalk, holding signs, "He stole our trust." Carlos Rodriguez stood at the front, clutching Maria's wheelchair. When Jonathan was shoved into the FBI van, Carlos screamed, "Look at me, you monster!" Jonathan didn't. He stared straight ahead, radiating contempt. To him, they were still patients, inferior beings who'd never understand his genius. One agent later admitted. He kept saying, "You're ruining a legacy." He genuinely thought he was a hero. The media frenzy was instant. CNN cut away from election coverage for live shots of the raid. Twitter exploded with #FakeDoctor trending globally. But the most haunting moment came from inside St. Luke's. As Jonathan's mugshot flashed on TV screens in the ER, nurses, doctors, and janitors, people he'd terrorized for years, began to cheer. A veteran or tech hugged a trembling resident. "It's over. He's gone." In the cafeteria, Linda Cho sobbed into her coffee while colleagues patted her back. This was the real victory. Not the handcuffs, but the collective exhale of a community freed from fear. Jonathan's arrogance reached its peak in the interrogation room. For 12 hours, he refused a lawyer. "I'll explain this," he told Agent Ruiz. He claimed the fake degrees were administrative errors. The opioid prescriptions were misunderstandings. The patient blackmailed as security protocols. When confronted with Sarah Chen's autopsy report, he shrugged. "Chemotherapy is brutal. Some patients don't make it." Ruiz played the voicemail where he threatened Evan Reed. "You talk, I bury you." Jonathan smirked. "That's just how surgeons talk. High stakes, high pressure." Ruiz leaned in. "You're not a surgeon. You're a janitor who got lucky." Jonathan's mask finally cracked. His voice trembled. "I saved people. Maria Rodriguez walked out of my or." Ruiz slid a photo across the table. Maria in a wheelchair, her legs amputated from gangrene after Jonathan's insulin protocol. "She walked once," Ruiz said. "Then you took her legs." The public reaction was volcanic. Within 24 hours, St. Luke's CEO resigned after emails surfaced showing he'd ignored 3 whistleblower reports. The AMA stripped Jonathan of his Visionary Leadership Award and demanded all hospitals audit credentialing. Sarah Chen's violin became a national symbol. At vigils across the U.S., musicians played adagio for strings while holding signs, "Trust without verification is a death sentence." But the deepest wound was internal. Evan Reed tried to kill himself the night of the arrest. Overwhelmed by guilt, he'd swallowed a bottle of pills. He survived, but only because his daughter found him. In the hospital, he whispered to Eris Thorne, "I thought I was protecting my family. I was killing strangers." Eris held his hand. "You spoke up. That's how we heal." Jonathan's final delusion shattered during his arraignment. As he stepped into the courtroom, he expected silence. A room full of people awed by his genius. Instead, 50 victims' families stood as one. Maria Rodriguez wheeled herself to the front row. Carlos placed Sarah Chen's concert program on the prosecution table. Liam O'Malley, the boy who lost his vision, wore an eye patch and held a sign, "I trusted you." Jonathan froze. For the first time, he saw the people behind the revenue streams. The judge read the charges: 22 counts of manslaughter, 412 counts of fraud, racketeering. Jonathan finally looked down. This wasn't just an arrest, it was a reckoning for all of us. We'd built a system where a con artist could thrive because we'd rather trust than verify. Where doctor on a nameplate silenced questions. Where victims apologized to their abusers. The handcuffs on Jonathan Voss weren't justice. They were a mirror, and America didn't like what it saw. The trial lasted 78 days. But the real verdict came after Fraud thrives where vigilance fails. And St. Luke's wasn't alone. When federal auditors reviewed 500 U.S. hospitals, they found 1 in 8 had at least one unlicensed provider working in critical roles. One clinic in Alabama employed a neurosurgeon who'd learned brain anatomy from Gray's Anatomy. A Florida hospice was run by a woman who'd never graduated high school. The pattern was identical. Overworked staff, broken verification systems, and a culture that punished doubt. Jonathan's trial exposed 3 fatal flaws in healthcare. First, credentialing is a joke. St. Luke's process took 72 hours, less time than it takes to deep clean an OR. HR clerks checked boxes, not credentials. Jonathan's fake license? Verified by a 22-year-old intern who Googled Midwest College of Medicine and saw a Wikipedia hoax page, planted by Jonathan. Post-scandal, Congress passed the Medical Integrity Act. All U.S. doctors must now verify licenses via blockchain, with real-time checks against the National Practitioner Data Bank. No more photocopies. No more voicemail deans. But the law came too late for 3,200 victims. Second, whistleblowers are set up to fail. Eris Thorne spent 18 months fighting to clear his name after Jonathan framed him for drug theft. Evan Reed nearly died by suicide before speaking up. Why? Because hospitals treat whistleblowers like traitors. Post-trial, the AMA mandated anonymous reporting portals and 24-hour legal hotlines for staff. But culture changes slower than policy. One nurse testified, "After Jonathan, I reported a surgeon who skipped hand-washing. Admin called me dramatic. Nothing changed." Fraud thrives where vigilance fails. If speaking up costs your career, silence becomes survival. Third, patients are trained to trust blindly. Jonathan's greatest weapon wasn't fake diplomas. It was our conditioning. We see a white coat and surrender our skepticism. During the trial, Maria Rodriguez's lawyer played a recording of Jonathan saying, "Patients don't want truth. They want hope." The jury gasped. But how often do we do the same? We choose doctors based on Yelp reviews, not license checks. We nod when they rush us out of the room. We apologize for bothering them with questions. Jonathan exploited this perfectly. At his sentencing, he sneered, "They begged me to lie to them." The human cost reshaped lives. Carlos Rodriguez founded VerifyFirst.org, teaching patients to scan QR codes on clinic doors to check doctors' licenses in real time. Linda Cho testified before Congress, leading to $500 million in funding for hospital credentialing audits. Evan Reed now runs a support group for medical whistleblowers. His mantra, "Your silence isn't peace, it's complicity." But the deepest lesson was psychological. Jonathan didn't just fool others, he fooled himself. Psychiatrists diagnosed him with malignant narcissism, a delusion so deep he believed his own lies. At sentencing, he told the judge, "I am a doctor. The system failed me." This is the fraudster's endgame. When the lie becomes your identity, reality is the enemy. And that's why vigilance can't be optional. Fraud thrives where vigilance fails. Not because systems are broken, but because we stop demanding they work. After Jonathan, hospitals installed credentialing software. But software can't fix what's broken in us. The instinct to trust a title over truth, to prioritize harmony over honesty, to believe the worst thing is making a scene. As Evan Reed told the court, "I thought speaking up would ruin my career. Staying silent almost ruined my soul." It's already happening. Right now, as you listen, someone is Googling how to read an EKG while holding a patient's life in their hands. And you won't know until it's too late, unless you learn the signs. Warning sign number 1. The too busy for questions doctor. Jonathan's first red flag? He hated being questioned. When Maria Rodriguez asked about surgical risks, he snapped, "Do you want me to operate or give a lecture?" Real experts welcome questions. They explain. They pause. They want you to understand. If your doctor rushes you out in 5 minutes, dismisses concerns, or says, "Trust me, I've done this 1,000 times." Run. Scan their license QR code. Yes, it's required now. If it's not displayed, ask why. Fraud thrives where vigilance fails. Warning sign number 2. The revolutionary treatment no one's heard of. Jonathan sold Project Aegis, a fake AI cancer detector, to desperate patients. Real breakthroughs go through peer review, not TEDx talks. If your doctor pushes a miracle cure they invented, demands cash payments, or avoids medical journals, investigate. Google their name plus lawsuit or fraud. Check the FDA's warning list. Sarah Chen's parents did neither. They saw Dr. Voss visionary on a brochure and signed consent forms they didn't read. Fraud thrives where vigilance fails. Warning sign number 3. The staff who won't make eye contact. At St. Luke's, nurses avoided Jonathan's or residents flinched when he entered rooms. Real medical teams collaborate. They double-check. They say, "I'm not sure. Let's consult Dr. Smith." If staff seem tense, silent, or afraid to correct your doctor, leave. Carlos Rodriguez noticed nurses whispering when Jonathan entered Maria's room. He assumed it was hospital stress. It was fear. Fraud thrives where vigilance fails. Your action plan, do this now. Verify in 30 seconds. Before any procedure, scan the QR code on your clinic's wall. It should link to your doctor's real-time license status on the National Practitioner Data Bank. No QR code? Demand to see their physical license. If they refuse, walk out. Ask the uncomfortable question. Have you performed this exact procedure before? How many times? Real doctors will answer honestly. If they deflect, "I'm board certified." Get a second opinion. Be the annoying patient. Record consultations. It's legal in 38 states. Bring a friend to take notes. If something feels off, trust it. Maria Rodriguez knew Jonathan's hands shook during her pre-op exam. She dismissed it as nerves. It was panic. This isn't paranoia, it's self-defense. In 2024, a fake cardiologist in Texas performed 12 botched heart surgeries before being caught. His victims all said the same thing. "I knew something was wrong, but I didn't want to offend him." History repeats itself unless we learn from it. Jonathan Voss is serving 27 years in federal prison. But his legacy isn't behind bars. It's in every hospital, clinic, and exam room where we choose trust over verification. The next fraud won't wear a white coat. It might be a wellness guru selling fake cancer cures on Instagram, a therapist with a stolen degree, a surgeon who skipped residency to buy followers. Fraud thrives where vigilance fails. So here's your challenge. Become inconveniently curious. Question the expert. Demand proof. Make "show me your license" as normal as "what's your name?" Because the cost of silence isn't just your life. It's the next victim's. Sarah Chen's violin won't play again, but yours can. This was never about one man in a white coat. It was about us, the patients who trusted too easily, the colleagues who stayed silent, the system that valued speed over safety. Jonathan Voss didn't outsmart America. He exploited our deepest instinct, to believe the people we depend on are qualified. Thousands trusted him blindly. Hundreds paid with their health. 22 paid with their lives. And why? Because we assumed someone else had checked the credentials. We assumed the white coat meant expertise. We assumed asking questions was rude. Complacency costs lives. Every time you skip verifying a doctor's license, every time you dismiss a nurse's hesitation, every time you prioritize harmony over truth, you hand fraudsters a scalpel. But you hold the power to stop it. Scan the QR code. Ask the hard question. Be the voice that breaks the silence. Your challenge starts now. Before your next appointment, verify your doctor's license at verifyfirst.org. If something feels off, walk out. If you see a red flag, report it. Anonymous hotlines exist for a reason. Because the next victim could be your mother, your child, you. Fraud thrives where vigilance fails. So be vigilant. Be inconvenient. Be the reason it ends with you. Start today because silence isn't peace. It's permission.